Yeah, so thank you very much, Saida, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to try to share my screen here and see if I can. Does everybody see that? Yes, okay, great.
Yes.
And so to Luis especially, thank you so much for organizing this incredible conference. It's almost at an end and I've learned so much. I am so grateful to you in particular. This is just a monumental undertaking and it's just been so great to be among people who like love and know all of this stuff as much or more than I do. And it's just yeah, working on these kinds of things can be isolating sometimes, and it's just such a relief and so stimulating to be at a conference like this with such great presenters. And I don't know how you selected all these papers, but they've been amazing. So yeah, thank you so much. So just sort of word of introduction. I've had a hard time condensing this talk because it actually represents a sort of pinnacle of like a year of research and something I've just been working on sort of nonstop since the pandemic started. And so I'm going to sort of throw a lot at you. So apologies in advance, but hopefully I can fill in the details during the Q&A. So the project that I'm working on right now is on Platonism and Schelling's early philosophy. And so this is prior to the time that Schelling was reading Plotinus, for instance. But I think there are a lot of reasons to think that there is a lot of there are a lot of Platonic elements in Schelling's early philosophy. So I'm going to present some of those to you today, not all of them. All right, so sorry, let me see if I can try to minimize this thing so I don't. Okay, so Schelling's the major conclusion that I'll be advancing in this talk is that Schelling's debt to Plato and Platonism illuminates his philosophy of nature in 1799 in particular, and specifically the notion of potency or power. And so Schelling's Platonic heritage illuminates two compatible senses of Schelling's term potency. The first is the sort of more ordinary sense of a mathematical exponent, so to the third power, to the second power, and so on. And this represents iterative and reflexive limitations on productivity. And I'm going to show how Schelling's kind of drawing on Platonism, specifically the dialogue Philebus in that respect. And then second is the sense of a capacity or power, so Vermögen. And this is also, he's drawing on this Greek dunamis, which is translated into Latin as potentia, and is of course the root of all of these words in German and English. And so in light of this Neoplatonic identification of the unlimited with the ground of potency, I'll explain that in a little bit, we can really make sense of this notion of a capacity or power. Okay. Okay, so to the structure of this presentation. So first, I'm just going to give a really brief and all too brief overview of Schelling's reception of Plato and Neoplatonism. And then I'm going to give an overview of Plato's Philebus and the four principles of all being. Then I'll give an exposition of the overarching structure of Schelling's nature in the 1799 works. And I'll argue that there are four analogs to those four principles of the Philebus in these works. And then finally, I'll examine these two notions of potency. Okay, so again, this is all too brief. So Schelling grew up in an era that was really heavily formed by Platonism. And I think that's something we contemporary folk tend to miss about this era of time. So this is just, I list here just a couple of features of this. So Jakob Boehme was the 16th, 17th century Lutheran mystic, and he had various acolytes that moved in circles with Schelling's family. This is, I mean, I think it's too much to put emphasis on these particular figures like, oh, it's all about Oedinger, or oh, it's all about Kostlin. I mean, I don't think it's all about any one of these figures. I think this is just part of the intellectual culture of the time, particularly the intellectual culture of the sort of religious tradition that Schelling was a part of. And, and it's also important to note that Neoplatonism wasn't really a term of use at that time. It's only in the 19th century when we develop alternative modes of approaching Plato's dialogue, that the Neoplatonists, sort of starting with Plotinus, going up to Proclus and even Renaissance Neoplatonists, that starts to get seen as like an independent tradition rather than a faithful interpretation of Plato. So that's just something to keep in mind. They wouldn't have distinguished between, oh, that's Plato and that's, Plotinus, or that's Proclus, and they're doing different things. That wasn't generally the view. Okay. Second, Schelling was exposed to Neoplatonism at the Tübingen Seminary. So his buddy Hölderlin was interested in the Renaissance Neoplatonist Ficino. He was likely reading at the time commentaries by Ficino on the Symposium and the Phaedrus. Secondly, and I think this is really important, Schelling's professor of mathematics and natural science, Pfleiderer, he was likely sort of intensively engaged with Proclus's commentary on Euclid. And Proclus is just, I think, a really central figure in this regard. And his commentary on Euclid isn't just about geometry, it's about limit and unlimited. These are terms I'll introduce in a second, and nature and so on. So it wasn't like just about mathematics. And Schelling often uses geometrical analogies. I think that he's just pulling these straight from Proclus's commentary. Okay, so third is Giordano Bruno's On the One, the Principle, and the Cause. So excerpts from this were published in Jacobi's 1789 edition of the Spinoza Letters. These are pretty, so we know Schelling read this, obviously, because he publishes his own dialogue called Bruno in 1802. He likely read it very early on. He had access to this edition of the Spinoza Letters. He cites it by page number in Of the Eye. So he had read Bruno, and Bruno is a kind of Neoplatonist. I'll talk about him a little bit later. And then, of course, Schelling directly studied Plato. So these notebooks, handwritten notebooks, have been transcribed, edited, and published sort of fairly recently in the 1990s, where Schelling is engaging with all kinds of Platonic dialogues, but most extensively and relevant for my purposes here is his engagement with the Timaeus and the Philebus, particularly the Philebus when he writes the Timaeus commentary of 1794. So he focuses on these passages where Socrates lays out these four principles of all being, and that is what I'm going to focus on as well. Okay, so let me this is just an overview of this really central passage in the Philebus where Socrates lays out four principles of all being. This is super important for the history of philosophy. This is taken up in a really big way by Neoplatonists. Okay, so he introduces it as follows. The God had revealed the division of what is into the unlimited and the limit. The one that results from the mixture of these two is our third kind. The cause of this combination is my fourth kind. So we have these four principles. One can think of them as a kind of hierarchy. So at the top, there's this cause. And then below this cause, there are the principles of limit and unlimited, or paras and aperon. And then the cause combines limit and unlimited into mixtures. And this is supposed to be, so everything that is falls under one of these, you might call them categories of all being, but I think that's maybe too much. The way it's taken up, it's more principles than categories. Okay, so yeah, the unlimited is also called the more and the less. It is always in flux and never remains, and it is closely related to quality. Yeah, he doesn't identify it with quality, but he talks a lot about quality as he's introducing it. So one example is the hotter and the colder, and this is the unlimited, with respect to temperature or something, and then limit combines with the unlimited to produce a particular, temperature or something like that, right? Similarly with pitch, right? You can think of like an indefinite spectrum of pitch, and then limit comes in and gives you like a middle C, something like that. So limit then is akin to definite quantity. Again, it's not a strict identity there between limit and quantity. Socrates calls it all that is related as number to number or measure to measure. And then the third kind is just a mixture of limit and unlimited. So almost everything that exists is going to be a mixture. So this isn't a Platonism that's particularly familiar to us. Again, I think Plato interpretation just changed drastically over the course of the 19th century. So this is kind of something that requires a bit of introduction and entering into a sort of different approach to Plato, in which this is like one of the central um, ideas in Plato. Okay, so in Neoplatonism, generally speaking, the cause is identified with the one or the good or the highest principle, and the unlimited has a close relation to matter. Again, it's not a relation of identity, but there nevertheless is something unlimited about unformed matter. Schelling interprets this in a particular way, and in light of the Timaeus. So he's trying to give a sort of unified interpretation of the Timaeus and the Philebus in the Timaeus commentary. Schelling interprets the cause as the divine demiurge or the craftsman of the Timaeus. He interprets limit as higher ideas in the divine understanding, which do not involve materiality. So this and this gets a little contentious, and I'm happy to answer questions in the Q&A, but right now you're just going to have to take my word for it. So these are ideas such as the world soul, Kantian categories, shape and number. Limit and unlimited are combined to form empirical ideas. So that's one kind of mixture is, for instance, the idea of fire. These empirical ideas, for instance, the idea of fire is combined with the material unlimited to form sensible matter, so to form fire, right? And then this gets a little complicated, but that's Schelling, right? Sensible matter is subject to a further combination with limit to produce higher level organizations. So natural laws or the world soul. And some of the details here are difficult to work out. My own view of this work is that it is not finished. Schelling sort of toying with various ideas along the way, and he says some things that are inconsistent. So it's not like this is a very clear interpretation. It requires some digging, but I think this is sort of what he ends up with at the end of the commentary. Specifically, one point of contention is how he understands these principles, the status of these principles, specifically the three higher principles, limit, unlimited, and cause, because he sometimes identifies them with certain Kantian categories. So limit with quantity, unlimited with quality, and cause with causality. But then he also calls them world concepts and says they only have an ideal existence, clearly referring to Kant, Kantian ideas. And he then tends to think of them as grounding the use of the categories. And this is the idea that I think he comes to at the end, that these are not Kantian categories, they do not have objective validity, but they are world concepts that ground the use of Kantian categories, so closely related to those categories. So here's a diagram. I don't know if this is helpful or just baffling, but this is the sort of structure that you get in the Timaeus commentary. So limit and unlimited, forming empirical ideas again combined with the unlimited to make formed matter combined with limit to make nature. And so if you think of it as sort of beginning with the unlimited, you have it combined iteratively in sort of a complicated way with limit to progressively bring it from disorder and unruliness to beauty, order, and perfection. So moving the unlimited from imperfection to perfection is a kind of movement of nature as it sort of gets formed by the demiurge. Okay, so that's Plato, Schelling's interpretation of Plato. Now I'm going to jump forward to 1799 and talk a little about the philosophy of nature. Some of this will be review from earlier presentations, so I'm just going to sort of crash through this one slide summary of Schelling's philosophy of nature. So in the 1799 introduction, Schelling posits a fundamental productivity in nature, which undergoes a series of iterative limitations to produce a, quote, dynamic succession of stages in nature. The lower of these stages is matter as occupied space, progressing higher to other anorganic features of nature, magnetism, electricity, and the chemical process. The highest of these stages is the organic. Schelling also calls these stages powers or potencies or potenza. This basic productivity is originally limited in a threefold kind of limitation. in order to produce matter, and then the resultant matter itself undergoes a limitation to produce a higher power or potency of nature, and so on. So this is not a reductive view, as others have pointed out. The higher expressions are sort of truer expressions of nature. So Schelling's sort of guiding thought about nature is that it is a thoroughgoing duality, which is both grounded in and striving toward unity. So this is clear, I think, in lots of works. It's, I think, there, although not like super central in the ideas, but it is central in the 1798 World Soul and the 1799 First Outline, and of course, this introduction. So in the introduction, Schelling articulates this as an original diremption of nature into opposed tendencies, a positive productivity, and a, quote, anti-productive tendency which inhibits the production. He says the latter is not negating, verneinende, but is rather the real active opposite of that positive productivity. So it is the limitation of the positive productivity which gives rise to the various powers of nature as described above. So nature strives to overcome this original antithesis between productivity and limitation through progressive unification into higher levels of organization. So along the way toward absolute unity, this dual striving of productivity against limitation produces what he calls relative unities or points of indifference. Schelling represents the extreme limits of productivity and limitation as the endpoints of an infinite line, such that no matter how wide the sphere of nature's unity, these endpoints lie beyond it, quote, so that it is always only the mediating members of the synthesis, never the ultimate and absolute synthesis itself, which can be produced, and the resultant unity is only relative, never absolute. So nature is thus always in a state of becoming and striving. It strives against limitation and continually produces more materials, objects, and organizations. Okay, so that's a sort of overview of the philosophy of nature. And here I'm going to say that there are 4 analogs to the 4 principles of the Philebus that I just sort of went over. So first, and I think least contentiously, productivity is an analog of aperon, or the unlimited. And some evidence of this, well, I mean, it is that which undergoes limitation to produce these various sort of structures in nature. So I think just on the face of it, it's a clear analog. And it's not even clear what the differences would be if one were to try to find any. The ambiguity that I mentioned in the Timaeus commentary is gone. So productivity is here construed as the indeterminate ground of quality, and thus as something which cannot itself be cognized. Only limited productivity appears in the product. So here's a quote from the introduction. He says, "What is purely productive without being product is just the ultimate ground of quality, but each quality is a determined one. The productivity, however, is originally indeterminate. In the quality, therefore, the productivity appears as already inhibited." So that is in any particular quality, like color, assumingly, so something like that. And since overall it appears most originally in those qualities, it appears in it as most originally inhibited. So yeah, just to reiterate, productivity as that which is iteratively limited in order to give rise to products is here playing a similar role to Plato's unlimited in the Philebus. Second is limitation as limit. So this obviously is close in terms of language, but so one way to think about how this is an analog of limit. We can talk about this analogy he draws with a stream, sort of a famous passage. He says, think of a stream which is itself pure identity. Where it meets resistance, a whirlpool forms. This whirlpool is nothing fixed. Rather, in each moment it disappears, in each moment it emerges again. In nature, there is originally nothing to differentiate. All products are still, as it were, dissolved and invisible in the original productivity. Only when the points of inhibition are given, the products are gradually deposited and they step out of the universal identity. All right, so this point of inhibition, right, is limit or limitation. And this point of inhibition combined with this sort of like, indeterminate, pure identity sort of flowing past gives rise to this product. And note that Schelling's notion of limitation is that of a kind of opposed tendency. and it is thus a little bit more active than Plato's limit. So it's a kind of active fixity, a standing firm as productivity swells around it and produces the product. He says, quote, only limited productivity gives rise to the product, end quote. So thus limitation, like Plato's limit, brings productivity to a standstill at what Schelling calls a point of inhibition. And this is what gives rise to a product, which is itself a combination of that productivity and limitation. Okay, third is nature as mixture. And indeed, that's how Schelling refers to nature in this work, is as the third. And in this, he's clearly drawing on the Philebus and the classical tradition, where the mixture is the third. So describing nature as a whole as a third thing, that unites in itself the opposed tendencies of limit and productivity. So this third thing is a striving toward indifference. There can never be a thoroughgoing or absolute identity of productivity and limitation, since, quote, the condition of the persistence of the third thing is the continual persistence of the opposition. And so there can only be kind of like relative identities or relative unities. But nevertheless, this third thing is that which is like uniting in itself these opposed tendencies. Again, this is a little different than Plato, right? So I don't want to just assimilate Schelling to Plato. That would be maybe, too simplistic. It seems like nature itself is sort of striving and uniting in itself these opposed tendencies, whereas in the Philebus, the product is sort of like, it's pure product. It's something that's put together by the cause. So here, nature is taking on some of the features of the cause as described by Socrates. Okay, and then the cause. The cause of diremption, I'm going to argue in Schelling, is a kind of analog of the cause in the Philebus. So in his Timaeus commentary, Schelling identifies the cause of the Philebus with the demiurge. This cause is traditionally taken, in the classical tradition, to be the highest principle of philosophy, the first principle, the one, the ground of all that is. Schelling briefly mentions such a cause in the introduction. He is discussing the diremption of nature into positive productivity and limitation, and states, quote, the cause by which this diremption is effected remains in the first place wholly outside of the investigation, end quote. Nature, Schelling repeats throughout, is originally identity, but there is also a diremption of nature into these opposed positive and negative tendencies. Nature strives then to return to that identity. And I could talk a lot about how that is an element of Platonism, this sort of movement of procession and return. But it progressively unites within itself the antithesis, right? So that original unity from which this duplicity comes and to which nature strives to return by overcoming that duplicity can be regarded as this idea, this ultimate cause, the absolute, so on and so forth. So Schelling states in his handwritten lecture notes on the first outline, quote, nature is originally identity. Duplicity is only the condition of activity because it continually strives to return to that identity. And he goes on to specify that the cause of the duplicity is unknown. So again, this is a slight difference from Plato, right? While in the Philebus, the cause brings things together. Here in Schelling's introduction, it's actually that which gives rise to the original separation, which then needs to be brought together. So it's sort of almost like a preceding movement, right? From this original cause to limit and unlimited, or productivity and limitation. So in both cases, however, the cause is beyond articulation, and we only know it as that which grounds and makes possible the world in its various forms. So we know it through its effects. Note that this is different in kind than, I think, limitation and productivity, or limit and unlimited. These are not cognized in experience, but Schelling does not assert that these principles are beyond a full or satisfactory description. So not only can we not cognize the cause, it doesn't appear in experience, right? But any description of it will be inadequate, since it is the source of these divisions, which form the basis of conceptual articulation, and thus it cannot be determinately subject to these very divisions, these very conceptual articulations. So Schelling opens his Timaeus commentary with a quotation, similarly asserting that the maker is beyond description, and he calls it the Hauptsatz, of the Timaeus, the sort of main claim by which to interpret the Timaeus. Quote, now to find the maker and father of this universe is hard enough, and even if I succeeded to declare him to everyone is impossible. So there's a difference here. So there's some kind of access. So I think this is really interesting, right? There's some kind of access to the maker and father, but it's a kind of access that cannot be articulated, that cannot be communicated in language to other people. It is impossible to do so. So I think this is sort of really important feature of Schelling's thought here, that whatever means we have to access this cause, it's not one that is amenable to articulation, and therefore I think inclusion in a system of theoretical philosophy. So again, there's this difference, right? Yeah, okay. So again, just to reiterate, while the framework that Schelling adopts in the 1799 introduction is not lifted wholesale or without modification from the Philebus, I think there are a lot of striking similarities, and it's not a sort of stretch to say that the Philebus is kind of shaping Schelling's thought here, is at least one among several things that are shaping Schelling's thought here. And I'm going to argue in what time remains that these similarities are instructive. They show how Schelling is utilizing the model of iterative limitation, developed partly in 1794 when reading Plato, and we can also see Schelling drawing on Neoplatonic accounts of the unlimited as potency in itself. Sorry, I want to see how I'm doing on time. It's like I've got like 5 minutes, is that something like that?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Okay. So this is a sort of, I'm going to skim over this bit here just because this is the ordinary interpretation, and it should sort of already be clear how mathematical exponentiation is working here. But what I want to draw attention to maybe is how what's being exponentiated is the limitation. So this is a quotation from the introduction. The same levels which are passed through originally by the production of nature are also passed through by the production of organic products. These, however, on the first level already begin at least with the products of a simple power. The organic production begins with a limitation, not of the original productivity, but with the productivity of a product. So what's being limited, so what's iterative here is the limitation itself. And we can see the similarities with the commentary on the Timaeus, the way that Schelling talks about limit and unlimited combining in various ways to form the various objects in nature. Okay, and this is sort of a schematic or a table for how this works, right? We have the construction of matter, which is a simple limitation of productivity, simple, not in like, I mean, so there's still like this threefold movement, right, within this potency, but then the product of that construction is limited again, and we get like nature to the second power, so to speak, and then the organic is the third power or potency. Okay, so nature here unites in itself the basic division between productivity and limitation, successively limiting itself into different levels. Okay, and I am going to skip Bruno. The important thing about Bruno is that he portrays matter as potency. So I kind of tend to think that this notion of potency, sort of as it appears in Schelling's philosophy of nature, sort of suddenly, I think in 1799, has to do with maybe a closer reading of these passages from Bruno that were published in Jacobi's letters. But, we don't know anything for sure. It's hard to know what Schelling is reading then. But Bruno is in fact drawing on Proclus and thinking of matter as the lowest kind of product, the most passive entity generated out of limit and unlimited. So I'm going to talk about Proclus because that's actually a bit more instructive. So Proclus, again, is this 5th, 6th century, extremely important Neoplatonist, head of the academy in Athens. He develops a sort of, he really, well, he adapts the Aristotelian hierarchy of potentiality by melding it with limit and unlimited from the Philebus. So he draws a distinction between perfect or higher and imperfect potency. Something has perfect potency if it's actualized through itself, so like God or intellect, the gods, and if it is imperfect potency if it is actualized through another. That which is divine, of course, has active potency, but matter has passive or imperfect potency. It's like the lowest on Proclus's hierarchy of being. So between the divine and physical matter are grades of potency, decreasing in their activity and perfection in the descent of the hierarchy. So Proclus states, the whole multitude of unlimited potencies is dependent upon the one principle, the first unlimited, which is potency in itself, not the potency of an individual, but the cause of all potency that is. So potency there is dunamis or dunameion. This is, so here what's important is this identification of unlimited with potency in itself. And it does seem like a strict identification. And so when we think of everything that is, everything that is, right, everything that is a combination of potency in itself and limit. So Proclus adopts this hierarchy where you have the one or the cause, and then directly beneath this you have limit and unlimited. The unlimited is potency in itself, and the combination of limit and unlimited generate everything else. So the gods, all of the things that we think of as ideas or forms, all the way down to matter. Okay, so Schelling's hierarchy is similar but generated differently. So it moves from that which is most separated to that which is most unified. So we begin with this kind of separation and we progress toward unity. So each potency for Schelling thus increases the manifestation of the original unity from which nature comes and toward which it strives. So nature carries out this progression by iteratively limiting the potencies of its various products to bring nature closer to the co-equality of ideal and real, which is of course its origin. So Proclus advances this kind of descending hierarchy of potencies from the one, and Schelling advances an ascending hierarchy of potencies to the absolute. So it's important to know that this is a similar hierarchy. So people, so I'm not the first person who's noticed these connections. Tyler Tritton, for instance, has an excellent paper outlining some of these same connections in a slightly different way. But he says that this is Schelling's reading of the Philebus as anti-Platonic, and that it turns Neoplatonism on its head. I don't think that's quite right. Really, the hierarchy is generated along the return to the one rather than along the procession from the one, but otherwise is by and large in keeping with the Neoplatonic picture. Okay, so, and one should of course think of the further limitations as making more manifest the potency in itself, which lies at the basis of nature, and thus allowing it to appear in its full sense when it's co-equally united with limitation. So when it's limited to the degree that these things can sort of it's fully expressed, right, in further limitations. Okay, this is just a reiteration of the things that I outlined at the beginning. So I hope I've shown that Schelling's debt to Platonism illuminates his philosophy of nature in these two ways, that we can think of potency as a mathematical exponent, as iterative limitations, and that of a capacity or power in light of the Neoplatonic identification of the unlimited, which I've argued is akin to Schelling's productivity with the ground of potency. That's it. So thank you very much.